What's up, everybody? Welcome to System Crafters. I'm David Wilson, and today we're back with another Friday live stream. And this time I wanted to talk about a topic I think is kind of interesting. But before we get into that, let me just say hello to the people who are here so far. Let's see, I think somebody's name is hidden there, but I'll get them later. Drashal, Valentine, West's Channel, Chuquan Chang, let's see, Robert, P. Polly, and that's all the people that I can see so far. AC Bass, Daigo, Mark, Cesar, Mark, another Mark. Let's see, Samuel Jackson. All right, Horatio, Ahmed. Lots of folks here today. Thanks so much for joining. Hey, Diego. Let's see, let me check my stuff. Yeah, YouTube is complaining at me one more time that they're not receiving enough data to get a smooth stream, but we're gonna see whether that's the case or not. Hey, Marcos. Gone. I was there, I was here. I don't know what that means. Let's see. All right, so Marco says, have I had breakfast? It's 7 p.m. where I'm at right now, so I haven't had dinner yet. So we're gonna see how coherent my speaking and thoughts are around the 2-hour mark. We'll see in a moment. Cool, so today I want to talk about a topic that really requires your input. And basically it's just a discussion about whether Emacs is hard or intimidating to learn. And we already know what the answer to this question is, but I really want to get more into the specifics about what you have seen as you try to learn Emacs, or even if you haven't really fully learned Emacs yet and you're trying to learn Emacs, what things that you find to be hard or even intimidating about learning Emacs. I have my own perspective on this, but I really want to hear more from you all about what you think, because I'm trying to get more insight into the types of problems people have so I can make better videos to try to illuminate some of these concepts. Since I've been making a lot of videos about Emacs so far, I've been making it from my own perspective of what I think is interesting, but there's a lot of things that I probably haven't encountered that other people have encountered. You know, problems with learning the basics, or even, you know, how do you get past the basics and start to learn how to really customize Emacs, etc. So, yeah, I think it's gonna be really cool to have a discussion about this, and hopefully we can all learn a lot from each other about things that are kind of the difficult parts of learning Emacs. Hi, Pushkar. Ahmed says it's not hard, it's just scary. Okay, so that's really a good place to start. So what do you feel is scary about learning Emacs? Is it the fact that when you start Emacs, you sort of get dropped into an interface, you don't really know what to do next? Or is it sort of seem daunting because you know there's a lot of things that maybe you have to learn and you don't know where to start? Frank says, remembering keyboard shortcuts, especially when English is not your first language. Let me go ahead and start making some notes on these things. So let's say scary for the first few days at least. Also, remembering keyboard shortcuts. Don't know where to start. Especially if Emacs is, if English is a second language. And also someone else said above, what was that? ppoly11 says, a lot of configuration details is a shifting sand of minutia for the base user, and then a lot is thrown away to do it in a different way. I think there was another thing that they said. Off-putting to beginners is a lack of stable basis for configurations. Let's talk about that too. Lack of stable basis for configurations. Or a, yeah. So like, let's say, i.e., a good starting point, as opposed to nothing really. Because, you know, when you start Emacs, they don't give you like a starting configuration to use to build on. You basically just get a non-existent init.el file that you have to start filling in yourself if you want to. Drashal says, it's simple. If you're coming from Notepad, then Emacs is hard. If you're coming from VS Code, it's a bit okay. If you're coming from Vim, it won't take more than a week to get used to. Yeah, I mean, I suppose that is certainly one way to look at it. I would say that if you're coming from Notepad and you start Emacs for the first time, it's probably not going to look very scary to you, because it's just going to look like another kind of Notepad. Because when you start it up, it's got that white theme. You don't see anything except for a menu bar, toolbar, and then the window for editing text. Now, the one thing it doesn't do is start you in a blank file, a blank unsaved file. It starts you in the scratch buffer or in the welcome screen. So that is a little bit off-putting if you're used to the sort of Notepad or Notepad++ experience. But yeah, if you're from VS Code or any other IDE, you're probably going to be disoriented, because a lot of things aren't there that you would expect to be there from what is a more powerful editor. And then if you already know Vim, then you're probably familiar with quirky editors that are kind of hard to learn at first, so you sort of know what to expect. Let's see. West Channel says the user manual is also garbage. Yeah, so I'm writing these things down so we can talk about them in more detail. So the user manual is garbage. So I'm not going to use that as my own perspective, but I was waiting for somebody to say that. Chuquan says, I think Lisp is the most scary. You have to learn a new programming language. So learning a new programming language for configuration. Emacs Lisp. Yep, definitely. Gon says, CTS and RSI before I grokked evil mode. Concerns about RSI based from the key bindings. Yeah, certainly. Diego says, having trouble deciding on which new key bindings to create. Yeah, that's definitely a thing. Figuring out your key binding strategy for customization, I would say. Aria says, Lisp isn't commonly used, hence making it harder. Yep, definitely. Lisp is sort of a different mindset. Let's see, what else here? Better defaults is pretty good. Are you speaking of the package better defaults, or just sort of like having better defaults would be helpful? John says it's hard to sequence commands not knowing same, but knowing what operation you want to accomplish. Yeah, since Emacs does have some different concepts and ways of doing things, even different ways of naming common things. Let's say, we don't call things copy in Emacs, we call it kill, which really doesn't make any sense. And also the basic key bindings for things like copy and paste are different. So even at that level, I think it's difficult. So not knowing how to do certain operations because things are named differently or have non-standard key bindings. I guess we could say that. DePaul says, it does look scary at start, but once you know that editing is more than typing, you get motivated. That's an interesting thing to say. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Ahmed says, I started with Doom, not the normal Emacs. So Ahmed, since you started with Doom, do you feel like it was easier for you to get started with Emacs? Or was it still kind of intimidating from that perspective? Gon says, in the beginning, I used Emacs for everything, save editing files where I used Vim. Yeah, that's good. I do use Vim every now and then for editing certain files. I know, this sounds like heresy. DePaul says, however, the value add is not very clear from the interface. Yes, definitely agree with that. Subaru says, I first tried Emacs and got annoyed by the key bindings. It's easy to remember but hard to use because all combined with Control and Alt and make my hand do many weird angle movements that hurt my hand until I discovered ZA fly key. You know, that's funny. I should get into that when I talk about my experience as well, because when I first started using Emacs, the key bindings were really weird to me, and then I started using Ergo Emacs, which I think ZA also made at that point, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, ZA fly key is another thing that I had looked at back then. So once I started using a different key binding setup, then things were a lot better for me, and then eventually I found Evil Mode, and that helped a lot too. Kapil says, people posting custom Lisp functions for org mode scares me. That's interesting. So is it that you feel that having to go find code that other people wrote to help you to solve your own problems, or is it something else about their custom Lisp functions that scares you? Christian says, let's see, his chat is jumping a little bit. Where was I? Learning how to make it so to do what you want is time consuming. The best thing about Emacs is actually configuring it and making your own code to do your own stuff versus installing a bunch of packages. Yes, I think that's probably the biggest problem, is that since Emacs is so configurable, one of the biggest problems, since it's so configurable, and if you're the type of person who really wants to do it yourself, it does take a long time to get comfortable enough to do a good job configuring it yourself and not depending only on third-party packages or pre-made configurations. So it takes a long time to get comfortable and experienced with making your own configuration. All right. I might have to skip ahead in the chat a little bit. Cesar says, I've got interested by the comments of others saying you can be very productive after you dominate the key binding, so that kept me trying and learning. The most difficult part was some instructions for configurations and packages were very vague, not clear, or how to do it. Okay, yeah, that does make sense. So let's see. Community packages can be hard to learn due to documentation, etc. Appenzell says, wrong mindset can also affect the learning experience. Yeah, I guess, let's see, another way to formulate that would be to say not understanding the Emacs model, or let's see, the Emacs interaction model, and even the internal model, it isn't clear from the beginning. So the fact that it's basically a Lisp environment that allows you to evaluate code to affect configuration changes or even customize the experience isn't clear from the beginning, even to the extent that you can customize key bindings in very specific ways. Cesar says, after some years with closure, Emacs... Oh, do I have camera lag again? Let's see. Okay, I think it must be somewhat better. Let me check what is going on in the background here. OBS. Okay. Amal Videa says, being told to RTFM when asking an honest question is always intimidating and disheartening. Yeah, that is never a good thing. I really don't like it when people in communities do stuff like that. So being told to RTFM when asking legitimate questions. So yeah, the community aspect is a big deal as well, I would say. Pavel says, personally, I think Emacs is less intimidating than Vim. You know, probably I would agree too, because at least there's key bindings in a way that you would expect there to be key bindings. Once you start getting into the modal editing style, it is harder to understand what to do next, and that's why everybody jokes about, you know, not knowing how to exit Vim because it's not obvious. But Emacs definitely still has a learning curve, I think. Obviously, I wouldn't have made so many videos if it didn't have a learning curve, I think. Vedant says, not good enough YouTube content to get started with eLisp. Yeah. There's stuff out there, but I think maybe it's hard to really teach eLisp well, because for me, I've got a lot of experience with programming languages, and I have like formal education in computer science and whatnot. So the way that I started the Emacs Lisp series was more focused on like the elements of the language itself. If I were to start it over now, I think I would start from writing configuration from scratch using the actual low-level built-in stuff in Emacs, and then sort of building up from there to bigger things. And I may still do that. So yeah, I think that any kind of discussion in Emacs Lisp probably needs to come from the perspective of pure configuration first, and then build up to like writing functions, and then at some point later get to writing packages. So let's write that down. Not enough content to get started with eLisp. Alexander says, I tried it after using Vim and key bindings are too complex. So key bindings are too complex, too many keystrokes. That's one thing that I also felt when I first started using Emacs. And the thing that was kind of stupid was that, for me, what I did that was stupid was that I felt that I had to press Control and then the letter to press, like Control X, and then lift my finger off Control and then press Control and then S for save, like Control X, Control S. I didn't know that I could just hold Control and do those two things. So that's not necessarily clear from the start. Maybe it's clear to other people, but it wasn't necessarily clear to me. So I felt that things were harder than they really needed to be. However, depending on Control is difficult because for many people, Control is on the pinky, which is like the weakest finger. So if you have to use Control all day for every single key binding, then eventually you're going to get some strain, which is why I tell people all the time, rebind caps lock to Control so that you can have it on the home row instead of on the lower left side of the keyboard. Robert says, I'm first year CS student with Java as main language, so eLisp is very difficult to grasp and there's too much to learn for noobs. Let's see, difficult to grasp at first for Emacs Lisp. Yep, definitely. Seabass says, Evil mode is not perfect. Some things that you know from Vim just won't work, such as Control X completions or incrementing numbers. So if you're familiar with Vim, Evil mode isn't really compatible enough. Hey, Simon. So West Channel says, weird terminology and arcane defaults. Yeah. Fill column, what's that supposed to mean? Also, why does it by default cut your lines to less than 80 characters? No other editor will impose such a thing. Yeah, so let's say antiquated / arcane default configuration. Probably from terminal days. Yeah, that's definitely a problem, and it's always been sort of a sore issue with people who go to the Emacs Devel mailing list and say, hey, we should like modernize the default Emacs configuration. And people are very reluctant to change things because there are many people out there who've been using Emacs for 15, 20 years. And if you start changing the defaults, then the assumptions or their assumptions of how to use the editor may start changing out from under them as they go to a newer version of Emacs. So providing a smoother path to do these new default settings is something that needs to happen before anything like that can be changed. So that's sort of an unfortunate situation that needs a lot more sort of community thinking to solve. And this is where a lot of these configuration packs come into play, where if you start one of those instead, maybe you get a lot of better default configuration settings that make more sense for people who are used to modern editors. So Vedant says, whoops, am I almost caught up here? Yeah, Vedant says, Doom certainly made it easier than vanilla Emacs to get started. It is less intimidating to use. Yeah, that's good. I mean, that's sort of the goal for Spacemacs or Doom Emacs, is that you should be able to get started faster and see the actual value of Emacs for a day-to-day workflow, and then be able to learn, sort of the concepts of Emacs without having to start from zero, which you basically do when you just install Emacs in your, Linux package manager or on Windows, and then start trying to use it, because it doesn't really give you a whole lot of pointers. I mean, there's a whole manual built into Emacs, but I think that these things aren't necessarily surface level enough. There's no like hand holding, which, with something like Emacs that's so different than anything else that's out there, you kind of do need a little bit of hand holding at first. unless things are just completely obvious, which is not the case with Emacs. Seabass says, evil mode isn't set up everywhere. Even with evil collection, some things do not work the way you expect with Vim keys. Yeah. Yep, that's true. That's a whole other set of problems where, this is where people start thinking, well, should I even keep using Vim keys at this point? Should I just switch to using Emacs key bindings? And then there's a whole odyssey of learning there. I still have not broken my habit of using Vim key bindings. I'm using it all the time. But it's convenient for me. Arya says, at least the menu is there. Yeah, the menu is definitely a benefit for people who are starting out with Emacs because it does point out certain things you might want to know how to do, and then also tells you what the key bindings are, and sometimes even the name of the command. So that's pretty good. Pete Polly says, Vim way of editing is distasteful for general user, except for those who have learned to live with it. Some power users that learn to love it. Well, it's definitely a completely different way of thinking, and people, it's hard to sell the value of Vim key bindings, I think. I mean, you could say, yeah, it's gonna make you a lot more efficient, but I think many people don't care about that. They just want to type and get work done. Mark says, agree about VI being more intimidating, but that doesn't mean Emacs is easy. I think the Emacs tutorial is pretty good, but manual and other docs take a lot of getting used to. Yeah, the manual is interesting. I feel like it gives all the information it should give you, but somehow it doesn't lead you on the right path to build your knowledge incrementally so that you understand the mental model of using Emacs. It tells you all the concepts, but it doesn't necessarily like hold your hand and walk you into the world. It just sort of explains things to you. Joshua says, Emacs can feel a little slower and less responsive than other editors. Yeah, so, see, Emacs sometimes can feel less responsive than other editors, which, yeah, I guess really that's more of an issue with your perception as someone who's trying it for the first time. Maybe you're like, well, this doesn't seem right for me because it seems slow or whatever. I can understand that. Pushkar says, Emacs is mostly used by programmers for programming, so a deeper look at LSP mode setup will be helpful. Yeah, well, for me, that's a thing I need to get back to because I feel like Emacs is great and all for, doing things like, writing your notes in org mode, planning your day, doing, your email, your chat, all these fancy things that you might want to do with Emacs. But if you can't do your day-to-day work, if you're a programmer or if you're doing anything relating to code, then it sort of loses its usefulness pretty fast. So teaching people how to do that correctly is definitely a big deal. Samuel says, the scariest part of deciding to learn Emacs was knowing how much of a time sink it would become. Now it feels really nice, but it took hours just to get configurations to be right. Yeah, so Samuel, did you know in advance it was going to be a time sink from other people, or did you sort of figure it out yourself as you went on? Let's see, knowing that it will be a time sink. Whoops, I just closed chat window. That's what I get for trying to use window key bindings. Here we go. Pop this out. All right. Hey, Benoit. Subaru, hopefully it didn't jump a bit, but it might have. My internet situation is not perfect here, and I think my CPU is doing some freaky things right now. Let me check ProcAd for a moment. Yes, for some reason OBS is just chewing up my CPU. All right, let's see. Hey, Tomas. Robert says, with Eclipse, I've got all I need out of the box, but with Emacs, I have to configure everything from scratch, LSP mode, etc. Yeah, well, definitely, I mean, you don't have to do that if you start to use something like Doom Emacs or Space Emacs, which if you want to get the benefits of Emacs without having to do everything yourself, I definitely recommend using one of those. Nasser says, Emacs manual is actually great. I think the short attention span of people can make it feel like garbage. Well, I guess since there's so many things that you actually have to read to learn there, it could feel intimidating, and maybe you won't want to sit down and read through the whole thing. John says the manual is a shining example of good documentation in my experience. So, so the people who like the Emacs documentation, what is it that you feel is good about it compared to other documentation you've seen? Because I'm curious to see what the perspective is there. Gon says, I learned Common Lisp when I minored in linguistics. However, eLisp feels like almost a complete new language. Yeah, Emacs Lisp is simpler than Common Lisp. I mean, they share a lot of similarities, I guess, in the very basic mechanics, but they're different. The things you would expect to be able to do from Common Lisp aren't available by default in Emacs Lisp, so maybe that's why it's a little bit challenging to map one to the other. DePaul says that the manual is actually great. Simon says, I think whoever comes to Emacs has a special interest anyway if you enjoy it, so not so hard anymore. Yeah, that was the other thing I wanted to ask about, I think. Let's see. Aria says, anyone knows what happened to Uncle Dave? I don't know. I know that Uncle Dave made a few Emacs videos a few years back, but I have not seen anything out of Uncle Dave in a while. Elephant says, cryptic defaults can leave new users stranded when they encounter init errors. Well, maybe that's more of an error message issue as well, because, you know, whenever you get an error in Emacs and you actually have to try to diagnose it, a lot of times it's going to use Emacs Lisp terminology like anything that's talking about like string P or anything, like where the code is expecting to use a value of a specific type and the code throws an error about that type. You're like, I don't know what any of this means. So I think that is a problem. Appenzell says, Matias Augusto da Silva has some good eLisp videos. I saw those. I haven't actually watched them, but I have seen them around. Marco says, for eLisp, some people recommend the Giraffe book. I have not heard of that. Set Kane says, for new users, which is better, vanilla, Doom, or Space? I think we talked about that in a stream maybe a month ago, I think. But it really depends, and that whole stream was talking about what the parameters are for whether it's one is better than the other for you, I guess. Marco says the Latin American Spanish keyboard isn't the same, so some key bindings don't work or are harder. Like meta slash, which turns into meta shift slash. Yeah, that is definitely an issue. I think that we covered that one up here somewhere. Pavel says, I use Vim for years, but I don't use Evo mode. It's neither here nor there for me. Also, many tutorials assume use the default key bindings. Yes, that's always a problem for anybody who's trying to teach anything about Emacs. I have to deal with this a lot as well, because if I talk about any package that has different key bindings between vanilla Emacs or normal default Emacs key bindings or Evo mode, then I have to do extra work to describe how to use it in both cases. And it kind of isn't great, but it just goes with the territory, I guess. Elephant says, I think having community configurations is a perfect solution for better defaults. I think it makes sense to be kind of conservative with changes to base Emacs. Yeah, I think that's the general opinion from the developers, is that it's better to be conservative with changes to base Emacs. And, you know, since Emacs is so extensible, you can definitely make your own configuration starter pack, basically, to make it easier for people. Gon says, I'm confused by all the different packages and the differences between them, like Helm, Ivy, Console, Council, and whatnot. Yeah, so many community packages that do the same thing, well, let's say, do similar things. Hard to know which one to use. Yeah, that's definitely a problem. I think it's become more and more of a problem as more people have started writing their own completion frameworks and whatnot, but I think there's sort of a progression there that makes sense if you sort of know what the history of these things are. But the initial user, the new user, would not actually know what that is, so it makes less sense to the initial user. Let's see. Pushkar says, before you, there was a drought of good quality, engaging content on YouTube. Now many people are learning Emacs for the first time. Thanks. Yeah, well, I'm hoping that a lot of people are trying Emacs now, and getting some success with it, because I would like for people to be able to use this program. I think it's a really cool program. One of my favorites. Let's see, Mark, whoa. So let's see. Mark says, it's hard to start using Emacs at work as it takes time to configure and be productive when the rest of the team have IDEs set up. Yeah, so hard to start using it at work because it takes a lot of time to set up a config. Whoops. Up a config to be productive, especially compared to other IDEs. Yeah, I know LSP mode and EGLOT are making that easier with language servers, but even then, even though we still have that capability, it's not enough in a lot of cases, and it really depends on how good the language server is and how good the integration into Emacs is. So it's challenging for sure. Benoit says, Doom with LSP is quite good to get quickly started, but if you have issues, you can't share with your teammates. Yeah, well, I think that's sort of one of the things where Emacs is sort of a self-selecting user community, where people who stick with it are the ones who are willing to put up with the issues where you're sort of stuck on your own because most people aren't using that editor. And, you know, having communities is really helpful, like, you know, System Crafters community or the Emacs subreddit or the other discords that are around. For being able to get people to answer your questions when you have problems, but still, like, there's something to be said for having, you know, mainstream documentation and lots of helpful content on the internet to follow. D. Ralliger says, I use Emacs since 20 years and I'm still learning new stuff. For example, 10 years ago, I have learned keyboard macros and I use it very often and to increase my productivity. Yeah, well, that's one of the interesting things about Emacs is that you can always learn something new, no matter how long you've been using it. Tomas says, I haven't switched from IntelliJ plus cursive after a year and a half, probably sunk about 200, 300 hours into learning and practicing Emacs by now. Yeah, that's unfortunate, but it can be true depending on what kind of work you're doing. Because if you need really deep integration with the IDE, into the platform, like for debugging and profiling and stuff like that, you're not going to get that same thing with Emacs a lot of the time. Let's see. Tomas says, I find the documentation annoyingly repetitive, but at least it's extensive. Samuel says, regarding why I knew it would be a time sink, I came from Vim, so I had a good idea of what editor configuration would be, so I tried several times before I decided to put in time. Yeah, same for me. I was using Vim before, and I kind of knew that it was possible to do a lot of stuff with Vim, so I figured, you know, Emacs had a similar capability. Ratio says the learning curve is hard at the beginning. Aria says, when are you going to use X widgets? I haven't messed with that yet. I should look into it at some point. Tomas says, Doom in hybrid mode if you don't have VI exposure yet. Yeah, well, if you do that, it can be helpful. Like, well, even with Evil mode, if you just hit Control-Z to turn off the Vim state and go to Emacs state, then you can use the built-in key bindings. Bernard says, I tried Emacs multiple times via Spacemacs and Doom. It felt like a slow version of what I had with Vim. What made Emacs stick was starting from scratch and configuring it to do exactly what I want. So that's good. I'm trying to remember. Do I have that? Yeah, okay. So let me just put that here. Being able to configure it. We'll get to this in a minute. So we got a lot of things here so far. Let's see what else people are saying. And then once we get through all the suggestions, we might talk about some of these in more detail. Benoit says, too many functions is a problem. They seem to overlap too. So you mean in terms of like what stuff is in the box, the built-in functions, and not being able to know which one is the right one for the thing you're trying to do? P. Polly says, I wish I had a button for some comments like Marco's above on modal editing, like being able to give a like. Yeah. Benoit says, it was working for 1 year and then broken, and I can't figure out why. Yeah, well, that's definitely an issue. Arya says, when I say I use Emacs, people think I'm some hacker, lol. This may be considered an advantage. Well, I mean, I guess that's one reason why somebody would be interested to learn Emacs is because it's cool. And it's sort of weird. It's weird for people who don't know what it is. I always get weird comments from people whenever I give presentations at work and I have like my full screen Emacs desktop environment set up, and they're like, what are you doing? That can be pretty fun. Oh man, this thing keeps jumping. Tomas says, seeing some package genealogy would help. That's interesting. Ian says, learning to avoid performance problems. Native comp, deferring package loading, daemon mode, fundamental mode when font lock slows keyboard macros down. Yeah, that's a good point. So there was something about performance that we said before. Maybe I don't have that here. So knowing how to get better performance out of Emacs. I mean, it would be nice if it was more, out of the box, that it had better performance for a lot of these things, but some of them aren't so great. Marco says, I think the one that helped me the most was Satashua. The folks she talked to always had something awesome to show. Yeah, a lot of those videos from a few years back are really cool. Like the ones with John Wigley and... what's his name? Sanity Inc. I'm blanking on his name at the moment. Etta says, I'm using Emacs thanks to you, sir. Right now trying to figure out all the options for org to PDF export function. Yeah, when you start doing org exports to other formats that requires like text live, it starts getting really complicated. In Geeks, I'm having a lot of trouble trying to get certain things to export to other formats, mainly because text live is kind of a pain in the ass to set up. Christian says, decision fatigue regarding different packages for the same tasks is a motivation killer because I can never be sure to do the right best thing. Yeah, I guess that's a place where recommendations from other people can kind of come in handy, or maybe just using a predefined configuration that already has a lot of stuff set up, because in that case, you at least don't have to think too much about it, and you can try something that already works, because part of the problem is knowing which one to pick, and then once you've picked one, setting it all up to be the optimal configuration does take time. So yeah, it's certainly hard to do that. So let's see. Decision fatigue. Motivation killer. Yep. Mark Owen says, I like Sachishua's diagrams. The one on learning org mode is really good. Yeah, she does really good, like this kind of sketch notes, I think is what they call it. Sorab says, using Emacs for the last 5 years, Magit and Org brought me from Vim to Emacs. Yours is the only content on YouTube about Emacs I found is well structured and explained. Please keep up the good work. Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to get better at it. Let's see. Marco says, my favorite hotkey is Control-G. Well, yeah, that's the one that I end up hitting the most in Emacs to get myself out of trouble. I called it Control Get Me Out of Here. Yep. Seabass says, org mode and Magit are the two things I couldn't live without. Yeah, those are, we should definitely talk about those things in a bit. Tomas says, I'm doing Clojure script primarily with 3 to 5 REPLs at a time with occasional JavaScript and AWS CloudFormation YAML, makefiles, and bash. Yeah, when you start doing things with a lot of different languages, having consistent higher productivity functionality for each of those languages and platforms is very hard in Emacs. I still don't have a good solution for YAML, even though I have to use it quite often and I have to open very big YAML files a lot of times, and that ends up getting a little bit wonky in Emacs. I've tried using some folding packages for that, and it hasn't really worked well for me. West's channel says, Emacs can't deal with long lines. It isn't so much of a beginner problem, but it sucks that you're evaluating code that returns a lot of data. It happens in Clojure when working with REPL. Interesting. Yeah, I think that's a problem a lot of people face. There is a package that can help with that, I think, called Emacs I think it's very long file, not very long line, but long file. think it's Emacs VLF or something like that. Oh, there's a whole entry on Emacs Wiki about long lines, so you might want to check that. Ah, oh, okay, this is maybe something different. Replaced by visual fill column. Well, at any rate, long lines are well known to have a problem in Emacs, I think. Pedro says an Emacs map of packages would be great. Yeah, having some kind of organized view of what types of packages exist and the relationships between them could be pretty cool, I think. Bright Sage says, I'm learning Emacs and found that the manuals aren't bundled with Debian, necessitating me to go out of my way to figure out how to install them. Really? Well, it should be built into Emacs. If it's not in Emacs already, let's see, it was info. If you run the info command, I would hope that the Emacs manual shows up there. And if it doesn't, then that's really surprising, especially for Debian. Gon says, the good thing is you can fire up the beast and you don't have to leave it for anything. SSH, tramp, email, Usenet, browsing. Yeah, I'm still missing my brew coffee command. Yeah, I mean, I'm literally here all day in Emacs doing most of my stuff. Just, browsers and some random programs here and there. Antonio says, jumped into Emacs in the 90s, use it every day. Flirted sometime with X Emacs, still amazes me after all this time. Yeah, I kind of feel like Emacs is the program that I still remain pretty excited about no matter how long I use it, just because there's so much I can do with it. And I'm starting to do even more things now, like custom integrations with stuff. A lot of the things I'm doing now with the recording videos and live streaming, I've got it hooked into Emacs. For instance, now whenever I do a video recording and I'm going through my presentation slides, I'm actually automatically recording timestamps for each of the slide titles and saving it out to an org file so that I can copy and paste those into the video description whenever I make the video, so that you have all the nice little chapters at the bottom. So just because I can write some Emacs Lisp in about 10 minutes, I can make this kind of functionality that is basically really difficult to do in any other editor, which I think is kind of amazing. Tomas says, Protesilaus, yeah, he has a lot of really cool videos. I haven't watched a whole lot of them, but I think he just had one that came out a day or two ago about Dired, which I think people should check out. Louise says, when I started using Emacs, one of the biggest difficulties was finding content. So finding content for learning. And not counting on the official documentation. Yep. Aria says, when are you going to try Remax? Well, Remax has been abandoned, so I don't think I'll be trying it. From what I understand, nobody's working on that project anymore. Marco says, at the moment, I was really bummed out about not having someone to ask or share the hype with. Yeah, if you don't have a community of people to talk about something you're passionate about, it kind of takes some of the fun out of it, I think. Yeah, Shabam says, even if you find some blog or video on a particular topic, if the package is updated, then the blog video is less helpful. I've already had that problem like 3 times, I think. Certain packages I've already made videos on have made pretty, I don't know if I'd call them to go so far as to say breaking changes, but have been changed enough that some of the things I said in a video are not accurate anymore. So that is definitely a problem. But I guess it's a reason to make new videos. So, if you're a person making content on YouTube or on a blog or something, having new things to talk about is never a bad thing necessarily. It's just, more work. Let's see. Andra says, hello, am I late? Yeah, a little bit late, but it's okay. No problem. Chuquan Cheng says, awesome Emacs maybe. Yeah, that awesome Emacs is a really good list of things that you should check out if you want to see a good listing of different types of Emacs packages for different categories. There's a lot of stuff there that you can take a look at. So yeah, a lot of stuff. Definitely check that out. I'll just copy it over to the chat in case anybody wants to take a look at it. Benoit says Emacs does not run well on Windows. Yeah, that's one major gripe I have with it, because sometimes I do have to use Windows, and the experience of using Emacs on Windows is not great, especially when you start using Magit. And it's not Magit's fault, it's actually the Git program's fault for being slow. And I think that's something else that's Windows' fault, or maybe MingW's fault or something. So the blame lies somewhere, and I can't tell you why, but Emacs is definitely slower on Windows. Pushkar says most people prefer IDEs because they're quick, while Emacs is for tinkerers. Yeah, definitely. I mean, the people who stick with Emacs probably are the ones who realize how much it allows you to tinker and have fun. Anders says you need to add Emacs documentation in Debian, as the documentation isn't properly free. It isn't. It has to be, because it's under the free documentation guidelines or whatever, the license for that. Tyler makes a good point. The core idea of major modes and minor modes is hard to explain to beginners. After about a week of introducing my friend to it, I realized that he believed that org mode and Emacs were the same thing. Yeah, I guess now that people are more used to editors that have extensions, like let's say VS Code, you can go look at all the extensions that you can install. It's easier to explain what an Emacs package is. However, major and minor modes maybe don't make as much sense. And the thing is that I feel like major and minor modes are actually one of the most interesting parts of Emacs that differs from other editors, because it makes it really clear how there are some bits of functionality that are relative to the view that you're currently in, and there's some bits of functionality that may be relative to the current view. They may be relative to all views that you have open, all buffers that you have open. And it provides really nice extensibility points for various things. So I feel like the mode system in Emacs and the way that key maps and hooks work is kind of like one of the secret powers of Emacs compared to other things I've seen, like the extensibility for other types of editors. I feel like that everything else has this kind of more rigid API for extensibility, that you have to do a lot more sort of boilerplate stuff to affect the same kind of things you can do in Emacs. I think that major and minor modes have a lot to do with the fact that there's so much extra cool stuff you can do in Emacs. What am I missing here? Sarab says Emacs on Windows is most intimidating for new users who wants to try and use for organizing stuff with org mode, whereas Emacs go hand in hand with Linux. Yeah, I probably should spend some time making some content specifically for Emacs on Windows, because I feel like there's a lot of extra stuff that you have to do to get some of the same functionality. I use it on Linux like 98% of the time, so a lot of the things I'm talking about are sort of from the perspective of using it on Linux. And I know that's definitely a blind spot in some of my content. Like, let's say using MU4E for mail. It's not so easy to use that on Windows. And some of the other things that we talk about too aren't so easy on Windows. But the flip side of that is that since some of the things that are written in Emacs Lisp, like let's say eShell or DRED, are written, in Emacs Lisp with the sort of built-in platform of Emacs, it's actually more portable to Windows, so you get some of the same functionality and benefits that you don't really get easily in other Windows programs. So like eShell is pretty awesome because it's a bash-like shell that you can run Lisp commands in it, or Lisp expressions in it. So you don't have that anywhere else in Windows, but it's cool that you can use Emacs to get that. DRED is pretty useful too, I think, on Windows. Let's see. Hi, Louise. The Seabass says, I wish I had in real life friends who use Emacs. Well, I don't. This is why I created the community of people, so I could talk about Emacs to them, because I don't have any friends. I have maybe a couple of coworkers who also use Emacs, but not necessarily to the same extent that I do. So even in that way, like if someone uses Emacs, but they don't really get really down deep into configuration and doing as much as possible with it, you won't have as fun of a conversation with them as you would have with someone who's like really, really deep into it. So that's why having a community like System Crafters Discord or IRC or the other Emacs communities is really helpful for being able to talk to people and not feeling like you're a crazy person who's obsessing over this weird editor that was created in the 80s. So Anders says the license for the Emacs manual isn't free as defined by Debian. That's pretty weird. I didn't know that, if that's true. Ronnie says Emacs is as hard as you want to make it, but at that point you're so good at it that it becomes easy. I can agree with that to some extent. I mean, if you just open Emacs and use it at face value, just figuring out how to open files and edit them and save them and not really getting into anything else, then maybe it doesn't seem that hard. But yeah, if you start trying to do customization or pulling in third-party packages, then it does get harder. But then if you learn how to do all that stuff, then it does get easier. So that's a pretty good point. Abel says, it would be very nice to have a well-structured, interactive way to learn Emacs. So far, I haven't seen one. Your videos help so much to the people trying to learn Emacs. Thanks. The tutorial that's built into Emacs could be considered an interactive way to learn Emacs, but I think it's very focused on the sort of mechanics of text editing and not necessarily things that go outside of that. So that's a good point. Let's see, not enough interactive teaching or learning tools, I guess you could say. Benoit says Emacs only works as an editor of a lifetime. Yeah, I think really if you want to use Emacs, you kind of need to commit to Emacs. Otherwise, it doesn't really make as much sense. Seabass says the reason why Magit is slow on Windows is that Magit spins up a ton of Git processes, and starting processes on Windows is very slow. That's definitely one part of it. I think there's also an issue with file system access that might be causing it too. Anders says you're not allowed to modify the documentation. Well, you are allowed to modify the documentation, aren't you? That's kind of the point. Huh. Oh, okay. I've never heard of that before, but it's interesting to learn. Haha. Tomas says, and then you have themes, which are not necessarily visual themes, but variable settings sets. Well, honestly, that's a better way to think about themes than what you see in other editors, because you're sort of like making a concept too narrow. You're saying, okay, themes are only about colors and maybe fonts and not about anything else. But it's kind of cool to think about a theme being something that you can install that it could also set better defaults in Emacs. Benoit says Emacs has no plugins, so a mode can break Emacs as part of the editor. It's good and bad. Yeah, there's no isolation for sure. So if you install something that is problematic, has bugs, then it can break your Emacs session. Edda says that LaTeX and spell checking with Windows was a pain to get working right, but on Linux it was really simple. Yeah, definitely things like that. Anything that's like a Linux specific tool is going to be harder to get to use right with Emacs on Windows, I think. Elephant says using Emacs and graphical WSL will make things a lot easier just in general. Yep, I mean, if you're able to use like actual Linux Emacs inside of Windows subsystem for Linux with a whole new graphical thing that's coming up, that would make it easier, but still doesn't beat using Linux itself, you know, like an actual Linux install, in my opinion. I'm going to butcher the pronunciation of this name. Sorry about that. Sabayashi says, Doom Emacs might be a good starting point. Yeah, Doom is a great starting point for anyone who wants to understand the value of Emacs without having to do a lot of work up front. West says, Emacs runs better on WSL than natively on Windows. Yeah, it does. If you don't have any of the performance issues that WSL2 has, I think. What is that? Arya says, I don't have any in real life friends who use Linux. Do I have? Yeah. I mean, maybe one or two. Not many, I think. Let's see. So Anders is copying a quote. It's not compliant with the Debian free software guidelines. In particular, this includes some of the GNU Emacs info pages as they are covered under the GFDL and specify invariant sections. Okay. Mark says, I agree it's hard to find other people who use Emacs. There's only one meetup in London for Emacs nestled among all those for Kubernetes. Yeah. Simon says, I'm also a bit of an alien at work. I don't know anyone in real life who uses Emacs, but I also wear my Emacs shirt once a week in private. Until now, there's no contact. Yeah. I should get an Emacs shirt. Arya says the best interactive way to learn anything is to learn from friends. Yeah, well, that's why, you know, being a part of a community is so important, is that you can get past a lot of hurdles a lot faster if you have people to talk to. Pushkar says, how could one update Emacs to the latest version on Debian? Install Geeks and then install Emacs with Geeks, or install Geeks as a package manager on Debian, which is fairly possible. In fact, if you're using Debian testing right now, I think it's Debian 11, Geeks is in the Debian package repository, then you can install Geeks, the package manager, and then you can use Geeks, the package manager, to install Emacs. So that will give you Emacs 27. You can also install Emacs 28 using the Flat Watson repository. Let me check my chat here. Okay. Shabam says, Emacs is like having a girlfriend. Oh boy, Ahmed, I think that YouTube thinks you're saying something bad, but I'm going to show it because I know you're not. Let's see. Where was that? That was the reading. Shabam said that Emacs is like having a girlfriend. I missed it. Right there. If you think she's the one, then spend a lot of time and effort and you'll be happiest. Of course, there will be bumps in the road, but that's a journey. Yeah, I mean, Emacs definitely requires a commitment, I think, to getting good at it before you really get the most out of it, for sure. Seabass says Emacs and WSL is still slow when editing files on a Windows file system. Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest issues there. Because anything that has to translate over to the Windows file system, even under that layer, I think is slower. Let's see. Shabam says, I've convinced my friend group to switch to Linux. Well, that's great. Hopefully they enjoy it and don't regret it. Depends on which distro you install, I suppose. Tomas says, I would wear an Emacs t-shirt with System Crafter's logo. Yeah, you know, this is the thing with me sort of being a bit of a procrastinator. I really want to have a System Crafter shirt and, you know, the coffee cup that I showed on the stream some time ago. But I just don't get my butt in a gear to set all that up. But it's coming. It would be cool to have an Emacs / System Crafter shirt. That'd be great. I might need to get permission from Nicholas to use the logo. Diego says, Emacs is glorious as a console editor, no GUI in WSL. Yeah, you know, using Emacs in the terminal gives you a lot more options as far as where you can use it, because you can use it on your phone if you have an Android phone with the Termux program. Termux is basically like an embedded Linux distribution that runs in your phone, which is great because you have all the same, well, not all the same programs, but a lot of the same programs you would expect to use on the terminal inside of Android, and Emacs is one of them. But using Emacs and Emacs key bindings on a phone keyboard is a little bit challenging. So I haven't really gotten super comfortable using it, but it is possible. I've done a fair amount of stuff with Emacs on the phone. I've written Emacs Lisp on the phone and made it work using Termux. So that's pretty cool. Louise says, I use as Linux as an OS in my job. I do a lot of templates in Emacs and use Emacs as an agenda for all my sector. Yeah, Emacs is great for project planning. Whoa, what's happening? Okay, passphrase. All right. Anders says, sudo apt install Emacs. Yeah, I think that if you're on Debian 10 or whatever the current release is, you only get Emacs 26, unless I'm mistaken. Bernard says, I usually compile the latest version. That's actually a good suggestion because compiling Emacs is not that hard. And, well, I'm going to say in my experience, it's not that hard. Maybe you have a different experience on that. And if you do have problems compiling Emacs, definitely come to the Systems Crafters Discord and we can talk about it. But Bernard basically says, if you use apt-get build dep Emacs, then you will get all the dependencies you need to build Emacs. And then you can build it yourself from the source. So you can get Emacs 28. Arya says, when will Emacs 28 become a stable release? I don't know, but if you look at when the previous releases, major version releases have happened, they usually tend to be toward the end of every year. So I kind of feel like you might see it later this year, but I could be wrong about that. It depends on a lot of things. John says, in general, I think that the docs are quite complete and have examples and go through high-level concepts. Yeah, I'll have to look at it again because, I mean, I use the documentation, the manual, quite a bit whenever I'm researching things for System Crafters episodes, but I haven't used it at, with beginner eyes in a while to see whether it would make sense to me as a beginner walking through it. Anders says there are performance problems in how meta information is stored in Windows and in Unix, Linux. Yeah, definitely. Anders says it may be a video to compile and set up Emacs from source. That's a great suggestion. I should definitely do that. All right, I should probably get back to the main topic that we're talking about today because I'm just getting lost in all the chat at this point. Let's see. DePaul says +1 for Emacs plus System Crafter t-shirt. Anders says, don't forget the Emacs key bindings in Bash is Emacs, or at least Bash has similar key bindings, I think, for the read line editor. Let's see. Marco says compiling Emacs is fairly quick also. Yeah, it's not. It doesn't take that long, so long as you're not compiling libgcc JIT along with it. That makes it take a lot longer. Mark says, I learned how to compile Emacs on and install 27 on my Linux laptop and have thanks to Geeks videos, I have 28 running. Great. Arya says a channel called Emacs Elements made a video on compiling Emacs on Windows and Linux. Great, yeah. I've seen some stuff coming out of Emacs Elements recently. I think it's great that he's making videos about all that. Okay, so let me sort of circle back to what we've been talking about before since I finally caught up with the chat. So the things that made Emacs hard to learn or get started with. So let me see if I can digest everything. Hey, Ulrich. Try to digest the essence of everything so far. It basically just sounds like it's sort of hard to get over the initial hump of figuring out the model for Emacs, how to use it, and also learning Emacs Lisp is a big barrier because it feels scary to have to learn a new programming language just to configure the editor, which you don't necessarily have to do that, but if you're gonna get anywhere with doing deeper configuration, you definitely need to learn it. And key bindings are an issue for a lot of people, it sounds like, for various reasons. The defaults are not good enough. How would people feel about a configuration, a base configuration that has a lot less stuff set up for you by default, but then you could pull in certain things as needed to get started faster? Like, let's say you start with a very, very, very basic configuration that you can build on if you want to, that has some good defaults. But then if you didn't want to have to configure, let's say, evil mode yourself, you could just pull in something that configures it all for you. But then everything else you're left to do it yourself, basically. That's sort of what I'm thinking these days is, Doom is great because it gives you everything and you can turn features on and off. But I feel like you could have an even more modular approach that would be a better starting point. And it could be helpful for people like me who have to make videos with various different configurations. Let's see. And the other big problem really is definitely figuring out how to start using it at work. Because, it's a great program, but if you can't use it for getting your job done, if you're getting paid to write code or something like that, then you can't really enjoy the fullness of using Emacs, I think. All right, so that was great. Thanks everybody for all the feedback on that one. So one thing I wanted to ask also is like, what is one thing someone could have told you that would have saved you a lot of time or trouble when you started learning Emacs? Like, was there anything that you learned while learning Emacs that sort of unlocked a lot of knowledge or capability for you that you wish you would have known from the beginning? Let's see. For me, let me think about back when I started using Emacs. I guess understanding modes better would have helped. But people are saying System Crafter channel. Well, this hasn't existed very long, but I guess now, yeah, it'd be useful. Which Max is a good base, sane options, but it could be improved. I haven't heard of that one, actually. Interesting. Okay, so basic navigation guide on the key bindings. Yeah, definitely. I mean, you can do a lot of stuff really quickly in Emacs if you know the right key bindings, but it's not obvious what the key bindings are unless you go read the manual. Mark says how to organize config files. Yeah, I had the same problem actually. Mine was a huge mess. When starting your first init.el. Manikandon says mastering Emacs book. Yep, definitely. Specific resources like mastering Emacs. That there is a built-in tutorial. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I don't know if I knew about the tutorial in the beginning. I probably could have learned something faster if I had done that. Elephant says the thing that would have saved me a lot of time would be an explanation of const and list structures. Yeah, sort of a, you know, a better initial overview of Emacs Lisp. Yeah, DePaul makes a good point, actually. I think we can get a lot done without getting into the whole configuration stuff. We spend more time in configuration than using. I think a lot of people have problems with that. Devrod says, try Prelude. Yeah, Prelude, I haven't used that one in a very long time, but, you know, Bazadar Batsov makes that, so it has to be pretty good. Benoit says how to easily find documentation. Yeah, how to easily find documentation for concepts. And in my case, if I had understood describe function, describe variable earlier on, I probably would have made a lot more progress figuring out Emacs and understanding it. Especially describe function, describe variable, etc. Let's see, what else I miss here? Basic file navigation creation. I watched the Dired video, but I still have problems moving around. So Vargas, are you saying file navigation like with Dired specifically, or just in general in Emacs? Bernard says, not understanding the difference between eLisp data types led to a lot of confusion for me. I didn't know why, yeah, okay, why there was sometimes apostrophes before words. So including things like quoting. Tomas says how to combine the features into a workflow. Yeah, help windows pop up, not focused, not sure how to close it, but winter mode is built in. Yeah, so understanding the general Emacs window management workflow, I guess, would be something. Tomas says, I would love to know about Helm, Ivy, projectile, multi-curses, and stuff like that at the beginning. Yeah, so maybe some of the more powerful packages, how to configure like projectile. And okay, so Vargas says DRED specifically. Yeah. So DRED is a funny thing because that was one of the last things I think I really spent time to learn well. I guess I actually wouldn't say I learn it, I know it well enough, but I know enough to use it on a daily basis. I don't know why it felt like something I had to avoid learning, but it's something that's so powerful and you can do so much with it that I think it would be a great way for someone to learn how powerful Emacs actually is if they could understand DRED very soon after trying to learn Emacs. Vargas says, once I got familiar with Doom's session tabs as project namespaces, it was my aha moment. Okay, that's interesting. Marco says, I'm not lying. Control G and reading the interface better, like knowing the name, what's fringe, what's mode, what's a buffer. Yeah, let's see. Explaining the unfamiliar Emacs terminology. Because, yeah, there's so much of it. And I think a lot of these terms got invented because there weren't things to call those back whenever they first appeared, in my sort of opinion. Hey, Marduk. Sangeeth brings up a good suggestion, which key. I think which key is kind of critical. Like, I think Emacs needs to have something like which key built in, because otherwise, if you hit a key prefix, you have no idea what comes next, and it removes some of the best kind of in the moment discovery of functionality that you really kind of need, because if you hit Control X, you don't know what's there. But if you have something like which key that's built into Emacs, then you can figure out a lot of stuff. Like if I hit Control X right now, you'll see that there's so many things you can do. You can run DRED from here, switch buffers, window management, lots of stuff that is possible there. So let's see, install which key. So if someone installed which key as one of the first things they did when they started learning Emacs, they might be able to get around a lot faster or learn how to do things a lot faster. Pushkar says learning Emacs Lisp initially for configuration would have saved time. I guess encouragement and instruction to get more comfortable with Emacs Lisp for configuration. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, Marcos does bring up a good point about the intimidating aspects of Emacs. The Emacs GUI is kind of intimidating because it does look old, and it's kind of looks cryptic, I guess, compared to other interfaces, or it can, I suppose, depending on which version you're using or how it was built. Let's see. Under says, when I learned Emacs, there was no web. Yeah, Emacs has existed that long, for sure. But there was a lot of other resources you could use back then, too, like not mailing list necessarily, but Usenet, Gopher. I don't know if IRC was around. Maybe IRC was in the 90s. Elephant says, remember when I said I'm rather conservative about what should be added to base Emacs, which key is absolutely something that should be in base Emacs. Yeah, I feel like that's kind of like a critical feature. Under says, didn't even have Usenet. Wow. Bernard says, Emacs has something kind of like which key built in. If you press Control H after a prefix key, okay. Control X, Control H. Well, you learn something new every day. Thanks, Bernard. So that's actually really helpful. I didn't know that. So what about Control C, Control H? Yeah, Control C does have one. Rad. Didn't know about that. Diego says, letting me know that I can chain keybinds by holding Control. Yeah, that's one of the things I was saying in the beginning, is that I didn't know at first, which would have probably made me feel a little less dumb, knowing that. Okay. Yeah, so I'm really trying to mine for things that I would need to tell somebody from the beginning learning Emacs, if I were to, let's say if I were to start over Emacs from scratch or any other, start over a different type of series for teaching somebody Emacs from the beginning, how would I need to approach teaching them so that they get value every step of the way and kind of understand the model of Emacs without having to dig too much further? That's really sort of the key here, because I think that Emacs has so much value in it that people could get from it. Like even to the extent that I would say non-programmers should learn Emacs because it can teach you how to program, because Emacs Lisp is so straightforward in a lot of ways, simple in a lot of ways compared to other languages, that it could be a very good introduction into programming and automation to some degree. So I feel like there would be a lot of value for teaching more people how to use Emacs, especially people who aren't familiar with a lot of these concepts. Hey, Joseph. Samuel says, I would have loved documentation that focused on concepts, kill ring, point mark, etc., and ignoring the key bindings. The concepts are so important, but I originally got stuck trying to memorize keys. And that's a good point, actually. Focus more on concepts. Whoops. I don't know why I jumped back there. Alien concepts first, key bindings second. That's a good point, because the key bindings are kind of irrelevant if you don't know yet what you have to do to accomplish the goal that you have. Let's see, what was the other one? I just saw something. Money Condon says, also knowing that Emacs gives you time to compose your key chords. Yeah, that's also a good point. Emacs will wait for the next key in a sequence. Yep, definitely. Yep. Tomas says, I've seen that Control H window before, but I didn't know how I ended up there. Yeah, there are a few windows in Emacs that I've pulled up at times, and I'm like, I have no idea what I just pressed. There's some hello buffer that will show up, and I think one time I also almost killed a stream by pulling that up because it locked things up. I have no idea how I got there. Pushkar says, the encouragement that Emacs is not outdated. Honestly, I feel like even though Emacs is very old and predates almost every editor, every other mainstream or highly used editor in existence, I would even call it more modern than most of these editors in a lot of ways, mainly because it has so much potential for longevity with the way that it's customizable. Because if you're dependent on the organization that produces a particular editor to provide you with extensibility functionality or even maintenance or ongoing updates, then you're sort of like handcuffed to whatever they do next, and you can't really help yourself. But with Emacs, you could do so much already. Like if people stopped updating Emacs, stopped adding new features to it, you could still do so many amazing things with it. And anyone could really extend Emacs in a lot of ways without having to be an expert programmer. So I kind of feel like Emacs is more modern than the modern editors. Now, obviously, you don't have things like, web-based interfaces that give you the ability to do CSS and WebGL and blah, 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 but I don't think you really need that necessarily. We could deviate on that topic and spend a lot of time there, so I'm not gonna go any further. Let's see, what else? I missed something here. Devrat says, I'd also honestly advise people to learn Vim if they haven't. I would too. At some point, I'm going to make a series about learning Vim, not to use Vim, but to understand Vim and why what it does is really interesting. I know there's a lot of there's people that would probably say it's a waste of time because maybe they think that the modal editing strategy isn't so good compared to other things you might use, but I think it's interesting, and I would like to teach people how to use it even if they don't use Vim itself. And let's write the thing down. I got on a tangent with encouragement that Emacs isn't too old to use or something like that. I think it was. Andre says how to use Control H. Yeah. Well, we do have that, right? Better initial overview, blah, blah, blah. How to easily find documentation for concepts. Yeah, so, you know, whoops. There's a key I keep pressing that brings me back to this previous slide. It's kind of annoying. Describe variable, the manual, etc. Okay, so Joshal says, I wonder, should I continue using evil mode or use the Emacs key bindings as it was meant to be? It really is up to you and what you like. I think that if you only use evil key bindings, it would be useful to learn how to use the built-in Emacs key bindings at some point, just to understand how to use it. I've had to get refamiliarized with them to do videos on certain things, and you can see me screwing them up all the time in videos because I don't use them every day. However, I probably should, so that I am more fluent with them when trying to use them. Yeah, Lawrence brings up another good one. Describe key. Yeah, describe key is critical because that tells you exactly what a key binding is doing, and then it gives you documentation about the thing as well. So that's a really big one. I agree. Diego says, I apologize for my ignorance, but I was told Emacs come from an editor used in paper printing computers and then was ported to Unix. I don't know if that's true for Emacs, but I'm not entirely sure. If anybody else knows, definitely chime in. Rick says, when I realized I could replicate my small vimrc fairly easily, I was ready to dive in. That's cool. Let's see. Joseph says, I wasn't able to watch the stream, but speaking from experience, I feel that Emacs has a different learning curve if you're experienced versus non-experienced. Yeah, if you are familiar with Vim or other sort of more keyboard-focused editors or configuration-focused editors, then it's not as hard to get started than if you are coming from something simpler or less configurable because you don't really know what to expect. Elephant says Emacs almost works like computers in Star Trek do in the sense of being able to cleverly ask it to do something in just about any context. Yeah, that's true. Like the do what I mean type functionality, etc. Contextual awareness. Andre said I'd never learned to use Vim more than to edit the file to compile Emacs. Ulrich, I don't think that Vim videos are coming anytime soon, but it will be at some point. I don't have the characters here to read this person's name, but realizing how powerful vanilla Emacs can be, reading the manuals and getting familiar with the jargons as soon as possible. Yeah, I think that's a common theme here is like, you can find some things out by digging around in vanilla Emacs, but there's terminology that is not very clear at first. And some of it's just outright weird, in my opinion. Benoit says the biggest unknown feature of Vim is the exclamation point commands. Most of the time you don't need plugins. You can call scripts. Evil mode even supports that feature. Yeah, I think Emacs does too, to some degree, with the ampersand. But maybe that's only in Dired. Sangeeth says, Control H is the thing that freezes the screen and does the hello buffer. It needs to be turned off for sanity. Yes, thank you. I need to go do that because it's happened more than once and it's really annoying. Pete Polly says, have workflow scenario stories. When writing a journal, I fire this, press this. In Python, I initial blah, blah, blah. Encourage advanced users to share workflows. Yeah, that's definitely a thing. Like, it's hard to know how to go about doing certain things whenever you haven't used Emacs before and you don't know what the workflows are. But that's, yeah, it requires some experience, I think. So it's very good if people can share their workflows. Eduardo says, let's see, build your own configuration step by step. This way you can learn what each feature does and how it works with the things around. No value in starting immediately with space or Doom as an example. Yeah, I think some people don't necessarily want to do that because they want to be able to be productive quickly. But, you know, a lot of people have watched the Emacs from Scratch series, which is great because it shows that there's a lot of people out there who want to know how to do things from scratch. However, I think that that series could have been done better and empowered people more if I had approached it slightly differently. So that's something I want to do at some point in the future. Mark says, I remember a few years ago, a colleague of mine called Emacs primitive. At this point, the search in her editor required her to push enter when she finished typing everything. Well, I can definitely see why somebody would call Emacs primitive because by default, it looks pretty primitive or old, but it's definitely not. Okay, so it's Barath, should remove the myth that Emacs causes repetitive stress because of its key bindings. Yeah, that's a good point. So maybe dispel the myth that Emacs will cause RSI, you know, change config, key mappings, etc. Yeah, basically, oh God, I swear, man, I keep hitting some key. Like this, I think it's left arrow that happens. But basically tell people that just because you use Emacs, you're not going to get, you know, a crooked pinky. Anders says, no need to rush on the Vim videos. Yeah, don't worry, I'm not in a hurry. Benoit says, how to set up sane defaults in Emacs is a long journey. Yeah, I've set some pretty sane defaults without very much code. However, it really depends on what defaults you're looking for, because if you need things like indentation defaults or maybe certain things for editing, maybe it does take more time to set those up. But it is definitely, it's hard to know what a default is depending on, you have to know who your user is basically. Diego says, I think the most important one would be running a long command by name with meta X and that it can be auto-completed. Well, understanding commands and MX from the beginning, that definitely would be useful for people because then you understand that everything in Emacs is at your fingertips and you can use it whenever you want. So I feel like that is a pretty a good thing to know from the beginning. So Pushkar says Emacs come from Richard Stallman, and Anders says actually Emacs existed when RMS got his hands on it. Yeah, that's true. Actually, I think James Gosling may have written the first Emacs, and then Stallman made his own for the GNU project. Hey, Felipe. Anik says, coming from Vim and using slash to search, I was really blown away by Swiper. Swiper is something that should have been part of core Emacs. Yeah, Swiper and also consult line, which is a similar function inside of the consult package. They're really cool. Really nice functionality, especially whenever you pair that with occur and you can start changing lines or text on different lines. Marco says, I know what made me want to show off Emacs and made me productive. Yas snippets. You know, I have not even really used Yas snippets. I need to fix that. Anders says, sane defaults are hard. They are different depending on what you do and when you do it. Yep, I agree. Lawrence says, if you're using Emacs enough to get RSI, maybe invest in better tools like an ergonomic keyboard. That can certainly help. But I think ergonomic keyboards have their own set of challenges. Like if you finally get your hands used to using a different keyboard shape or keyboard layout, I think that you'll end up with trouble using other normal keyboards after that, but maybe not. I don't know. For me, I just prefer to remap caps lock to control, and that solves a lot of my problems. Let's see. Simon says, I use Doom Emacs. I can concentrate on the fun stuff that way. Eventually, I will have my own config for sure. I already had before Doom, but I think Doom is currently great for me. I mean, Doom is a really good configuration. I think it's really solid. A lot of work has gone into making it really fast and have a lot of really useful functionality. So I definitely recommend anybody who wants to sort of skip a lot of steps ahead. Just use Doom and see how Emacs can be if you have a full config, and then later you can go and try making your own config from scratch. Let's see. I don't know if you can hear my child screaming in the background. Sorry about that. Andre says, yes, a video snippets. Yeah, I need to do that at some point for sure. Paulando says, have a set of best practices available for common workflows. Yeah, I'm eventually trying to get there with a lot of the videos I'm making, like show how do you use certain packages effectively. But cross-package workflows is another really interesting area where you start to integrate various things together, like org mode and the mail reader or RSS feed reader and all this other kind of stuff. That takes a lot more work to try to put that stuff together. Hey, Alex. Let's see. Oh, and also I should say, and Benoit brings this up, with Doom Emacs, you can create your own modules for Doom pretty easily, and you can add your own functionality that way, so you don't have to like use a vanilla from scratch configuration to write your own parts of your config. You can actually do that with Doom to some degree as well. Vivek says, I use Emacs just for org mode. For coding, I use VS Code with Node. Do you suggest using Emacs for the same? I use Emacs to write Node.js and JavaScript and TypeScript code for a full-time job. So it's totally fine for that. Now, debugging, I don't use debugging very much, but I use the language servers a lot for that. Let's see. Devrod says SICP might also have some value here as well. Yeah, I mean, if you want to learn Lisp and how to think in a Lisp way, that's a great resource. That's the structure and interpretation of computer programs. Qurantex, sorry, I can't pronounce that. How to use different layouts, because if you switch from English to something else, Emacs will not recognize key bindings. Good question. I don't have that problem, so I haven't actually run into that. But if other people have some suggestions on that, that would be helpful. Sangeeth says, Meow is an interesting package for Dvorak or other keyboard users. I've heard of that, but I haven't actually looked into it. Alex says, making a configuration from scratch was a single act that got me immersed in Emacs. Yeah, definitely, that was something that got me immersed as well, is like, really getting into the nitty gritty of making my own configuration. It was a lot of fun. If you like coding side projects, writing your Emacs configuration can be a rabbit hole in terms of a side project. Let's see. Marco says, I cannot share the lists in org mode with anybody, so not much point to org for me. Yeah, it is a problem sometimes. I mean, if you collaborate with people who use Markdown or some other format for files, then you can't really send those around to other people. So typically for me, I'm using org files for my configurations, for writing notes, these presentations you see. There's a lot of things you can do with org mode in Emacs that don't require you to interact with other people who don't use Emacs, I think. All right. So we got a lot of really good things here as suggestions for what someone might have want to be told in the beginning. So I appreciate that. I had something here about, sort of talking about my own experience with Emacs. I can talk about that for just a second. So over the years, I've sort of come in contact with Emacs a few times before I really started to learn it well, to the point where I know it now. In university, I came across Emacs in like computer labs whenever we had to do assignments for the computer science work I was doing. And I think I used it once or twice and didn't really get it. I've heard people talking about Emacs, about how great it was. And when I started the Emacs, I couldn't really tell just by looking at it what was good about it. So, you would hear online a lot about how great Emacs is. You would hear from people around maybe in university about Emacs. But I started using Vim probably around that same time, and it made more sense to me. And I used GVim specifically. So I stuck with that for many, many years, really, after that. And didn't really get back into Emacs until later, whenever I started trying to write Common Lisp. And I did that because I had a job where I was writing Common Lisp, but the stupid thing was that whenever I was working at the job writing Common Lisp, I actually wasn't using Emacs. I didn't start using Emacs for that until after I left. And I didn't realize what I was missing out on basically by not having done that. So I started using this thing called Lisp in a Box, which is basically a fully self-contained Emacs distribution for Windows for writing Common Lisp that had things like Slime already set up, etc. But even that was sort of like a surface level interaction with Emacs. I didn't really know what I was doing. I didn't know what Emacs provided there. I just knew that if I started Emacs and did these certain steps, I could start writing Common Lisp code and do some interactive development with it. And you know, it was kind of fun, but I didn't really stick with it because I didn't write much Common Lisp after that. And then many years later, probably around 2013, I started messing with Emacs again, learning about how to customize it a little bit more, but still didn't know a whole lot. I didn't really know about all the describe functions. I knew how to set the theme. I knew how to install packages, third-party packages with package.el. And I was learning about sort of key bindings and key maps, but I still didn't know a whole lot. And it wasn't until a couple years later when I started getting really deep into like using org mode for things and writing my configuration from scratch. And I started to enjoy Emacs, but I had a really hard time figuring out how to use it to write C# code, because that's what I was doing for my day job. I was writing a lot of C#. And at the time, there wasn't this idea of, you know, language servers that were so prevalent. There was a C# language server called OmniSharp, and I tried to use that, but I couldn't figure out how to set it up. And it was really just my fault not being able to set it up right. But, you know, it made me really sort of get frustrated with not being able to use it at my job, because I knew that it was great for so many other things, and I was using it for like planning my day and writing and a lot of stuff like that, but I couldn't figure out how to do it for everyday work. And then, you know, within the last maybe 3-4 years, I got really into making it like the full environment that I have today. And that was the point where I really invested myself into learning everything, you know, that you need to know to get really adept at using Emacs. You know, learning the help system, learning how to find Emacs Lisp code, understanding Emacs Lisp itself, all that stuff. So it's been a long road for me to get from having opened it the first time, opened Emacs the first time, to really knowing it deeply. However, I don't think that it requires, it's very nostalgic for Alex because he was around the same time that all this was happening. It doesn't necessarily require that long of a period of time to get familiar with Emacs. What it really requires is the right cues and the right information at the right time, because there's different phases of learning Emacs, I think, and there probably needs to be different content for different people at different phases of learning Emacs. So I'm trying to find the optimal path really to bring anyone from zero to being fairly adept at using and configuring Emacs to some level, because I feel like the more people who understand how to use Emacs, the more we'll be self-sufficient and really be able to benefit from all the things this program can do. Hopefully that was interesting. So I had another slide after this. Okay, so we don't have a whole lot of time yet. However, I do want to ask this question to everybody here. What made you stick with Emacs? Like, despite the difficulty in learning Emacs, all the problems you may have faced, what was it that made you keep trying to learn? It could be anything about Emacs. It may be like things you heard about Emacs, or maybe some specific experience you had with it, or some feature about it. What was it that made you keep trying to learn it? For me, once I understood how configurable it was, and the fact that I could write Lisp code to configure everything, and you could write pretty non-trivial Lisp code to do a lot of stuff, that was kind of the thing for me that made me want to stick with it, because I felt like if I really learned it well enough, I would be able to do anything I wanted. And it turns out that actually is the case, because I'm doing quite a lot with it now. I've got a lot of custom code I've been writing for various things, and it's possible to do a lot. Felipe says, being able to do everything. Yeah, definitely that. Monty Condon says, looking cool, which is not a bad thing. I mean, it is cool to use Emacs. Jonathan has a good point. Instant gratification programming, definitely that. Sangeet says, the feeling that it could evolve with my needs as I progress. It can evolve with my needs. Well, once again. Alex said, I looked back at my old workflows with other editors and I was horrified. I knew the way forward from there. Yeah, well, it's kind of funny. Hey, Jerry. Let's see. Diego says how fast and how low level it is. By being so powerful on the console, you can do most anything. Yeah. Understanding what Emacs is really capable of even on the terminal. Let's see. Onyx says not just writing text, but org mode. Was there anything before that? Yeah. Org mode, I guess, really is a big thing for writing. Simon says, no kidding, your channel and one or the other Reddit channel is just the feeling of being a part of a community, and I just like it. It reminds me of my first days on the computer and nostalgia. 100%. I agree with that too. I get a lot of nostalgia for the days of me using the computer and using Linux in the 90s from using Emacs and also using Geeks. So the community and also nostalgia. Perfectly valid, I think. Benoit says, able to use and configure one editor for all things. Yep. Ulrich says, great for writing LaTeX and Python source code and very configurable. Let's see. Feeling good when you get something to work when you tweak the config yourself. Yeah. The feeling of getting something in. Yes, I think that's one of the things that people who aren't programmers could really understand, that feeling of satisfaction from writing some code, even if it's just in your Emacs configuration, just getting something that you wanted to work, having an idea and make it work. There's something about that. Like anybody who's learned a programming language and has hit that point where, you know, you're sort of understanding this weird or trying to understand this weird syntax, and you're trying to accomplish some goal, and you finally do it. There's some kind of reward to that is hard to find in other places. And if the sort of average person who's not a programmer could learn that through configuring Emacs, they might, you know, it might be a gateway to them learning actual programming. So something interesting there, I think. Mark says, writing documentation, migrating from Markdown Pandoc to org mode, and clocking tasks for work. Yeah, so using org mode for time tracking. That's a really cool feature that I've used on and off. I kind of want to use it again because it's great for that. Also, writing documentation in org mode. Let's see. CruntX says doctor.el. Yeah, well, I mean, I guess it is a feature that could be useful at times. Anders says, now I have a third level as I can get inspiration from other users on the web. And the package manager support, org mode, and Magic got me started again from using Eclipse for a long time. Yeah, I think great packages. Org mode, Maggot, etc. Maggot, I said, Maggot. Palando says, I'm coming from Vim, and without evil mode, I wouldn't have even tried staying for doing everything in Emacs. So yeah, having evil mode available as a former Vim user. Yep. Yeah, that was kind of important for me too, I think. Because like I said, I had been using Vim before that. Samuel says, being able to curate my experience in a way that I can't anywhere else. Yes. In a way that no other program allows. Benoit says, lots of innovations within Emacs and ability to build on it. Anders says, a quality channel like System Crafters is also a great source. Yeah, thank you for that. Mark says, after swapping control caps, the joy I get from watching someone else trying to use my keyboard is worth the price of admission alone. Yeah, well, that is a pretty funny thing, I guess. Niva says, that's my case, not a programmer, but getting everything working in Emacs the way you intended in the first place is something special, especially when you encounter conflicts and resolve them. Yeah, you can learn the sort of the debugging process of, you know, figuring out bugs in code through Emacs. And I would say that if you can learn the actual debugging capabilities in Emacs, even to the most basic level, to understand how to use them to solve problems, it can be a very educational experience for non-programmers. And I think it would make programming less scary if you realize that you can actually sort of inspect what's happening. Let's see. Blackberry Boy says, great work you're doing. Thank you. That's Amore says, I'm convinced using Emacs has positive effects that are long-term. Yeah, like any good addiction, is only positive long-term effects. Definitely the case, though. I mean, I feel like the more that you learn and use Emacs, the fact that it doesn't change out from under you on a regular basis, it gives you a foundation for working so that you can build on it, rather than having tools that change every 2-3 years. Like, you know, what's the hot new editor that everybody's using now? You know, you have to sort of ask yourself that question every once in a while, because that does change. So not having to relearn everything and use all new tools all the time, you know, being able to invest in one editor, that's the reason why you keep hearing this concept of like Emacs is the editor of a lifetime. I think there was a person, his name is like on the tip of my brain, but I've forgotten it right now. But basically saying that Emacs is an editor that you can really commit to and get value out of for the long term, and not just, you know, in the fashion of the time. Onyx says, should a beginner go for Spacemacs, Doom, or learn vanilla first? It really just depends on what you want to do. I honestly, like, there's nothing stopping you from doing both of those things at the same time, so it's better to just try to figure out what's going to work best for you as a person learning it. Tyler says, limiting context switching. This is along the lines of using Emacs for everything, but the ability to run pretty much anything in the mini buffer while keeping all buffers in the same place is great. That's a really good point, actually. Changing input modalities, like having to switch between mouse and keyboard, or changing the sort of the conceptual underpinnings of what you have to do in your workflow, switching between programs, it costs something, you know, whenever you're working. And if you can sort of stay in the same environment as long as possible and be able to benefit from that, not having the context switch so much, then I think that you're more efficient. I feel that whenever I do work every day in Emacs, I don't get tied up in a lot of sort of, you know, minutia of trying to use particular programs, because a lot of what I'm doing is just the same old, you know, Emacs interface and commands and Emacs Lisp and everything. So, yeah, so less context switching. Yeah, basically just less context switching. Felipe says, nah, the hot new editor for me is always Emacs. Yeah, for me too, really. I keep coming back to it. Over the years, I just kept coming back to it. Igor says, easy and fancy presentations as a code. Yeah, well, you know, it's pretty nice. Alex says, Perry Metzger. Yeah, that's the right person. No company can deprecate Emacs. Yep, that's a good point. You know, Emacs in theory should live forever. If some other editor comes along that has everything that Emacs has and more, that would be the point where probably people would not use Emacs as much. However, I feel like it's just not really that possible, I think. Let's see. The prospect of zero context switching keeps me learning and growing. Yep. Blackberry Boy says, I learned org presentation mode from one of your videos, and it's great. I use it quite a lot now. Inline images don't work for me, though, because I use Emacs with -NW. Yeah, that's unfortunate. But yeah, I mean, being able to do presentations at all in Emacs is pretty nice. Under says, probably the only shortcoming of Emacs is multitasking and parallelism. Yeah, it's problematic at times, but not necessarily a deal breaker. Alex says, Emacs is the best cult yet. Well, I don't know if it's a cult, but maybe it is. They say it's the church of Emacs. Let's call it church. Okay, so I wanted to show a couple things Emacs news related, just like really quickly. One of them is very relevant because we're actually going to make a video on it for Monday or Tuesday, depending on which day I get to record it. And that is the fact that Orgrome version 2 has now been released. And if you haven't really been following the development of Orgrome or even really know what it is, I'll explain what Orgrome is in more detail in the video that I make about it. But Orgrome version 1 had existed for maybe a year or two, and people had gotten comfortable using it. Now Orgrome v2 has been released, and it changes some of the underlying mechanics of Orgrome, but I think it's all for the better and provides a really good basis for building on top of that to provide more functionality. So we are going to talk about Orgrome in a sort of a getting started video, explaining the concepts of it, how it's different than org mode, and how to set it up, basically. So Anders says, I have no clue why Orgrome is good. Yeah, I didn't either until I started using it. Now I understand. So I'll explain why to everyone so that maybe the value of it becomes more clear. But I have a link here in the show notes. I'm going to try to link this in the video description after I finish this stream, because I didn't do it last time. Someone reminded me. But there's a blog post by the author, or the original author of Orgrome, sort of explaining the whole process of how it came to be, which is pretty interesting. Has some nice tips there. There's also a guide to using Orgrome v2 for people who may have already used v1, which can be helpful if you have used Orgrome a bit before. So I definitely recommend checking out both these links if you're curious about Orgrome. You might learn a thing or two. Also, Emacs 28. Apparently there is a new option that has been added recently, which is really awesome because now it removes the need for a particular package that I've always been using called DRED single. So if you've never really used DRED before, or maybe you have used it before, maybe you know about this. Whenever you use DRED to navigate around your file system, when you go into a directory, it opens a new DRED buffer. So if you've been navigating around your file system a lot, you're going to have a bunch of DRED buffers for all the folders that you navigated into. Now, there's reasons for this behavior, but I always found it kind of weird, and I wanted it to not do that. I wanted just a single DRED buffer that gets maintained for the current session that I'm in for DRED. Now there's a new variable that allows you to set that behavior. It's this DRED kill when opening new buffer variable. If you set that to true in the latest commits of Emacs 28, it will maintain just that single buffer, or reuse the single buffer whenever you navigate somewhere else. So now that DRED single package I showed in Emacs from Scratch episode, what was it, 10, I think, that package shouldn't be necessary anymore as of this commit in Emacs 28, which I think is pretty exciting, at least for me. And lastly, those of you who are in the scientific field, which there are quite a few of you watching the channel, which I always find really impressive. Now there is citation support added to org mode. And if you've ever had to write scientific literature in org, excuse me, I don't know if this has really been a long-term problem, but apparently there is a citation support now, which can be pretty helpful if you're having to write papers. And if you have ever had to write papers in org mode, you've probably come across John Kitchen, who I think has written the org ref package. He's got a YouTube video I've got a link to here where he explains how to use this new functionality, I think. I haven't really watched it, so I don't know how far he goes into it, but if you want to check this out, this could be helpful to you. And that's pretty much it for what I had today, but I really appreciate everyone's input on the topic, because I really want to use this information to try to make better videos for beginners, especially shorter videos. I know this has sort of been a problem with my channel in the past. All the videos are like an hour or something. So I'm trying to come up with these insights that will allow me to give the best instruction in the most reasonably sized videos, like 15 to 25 minutes or something like that. And a lot of this information will be helpful for that. Anders says, is it possible to have the latest 5 DRED buffers stay open? I don't know, but maybe it's possible. Simon says, org download from abo does not work properly at all under Windows and Termux. That would be great if it would work Windows too. Yeah. Haven't used it that much. Ulrich says, how to update Emacs? Are we obliged to remove previous installation before installing a newer version? The only thing that you would really have a problem with, in theory, is the packages that you have installed, and making sure that there's nothing remaining from the old Emacs version, like precompiled, well, even that might not be a problem. I think Emacs deals with that pretty well. So probably you don't have to worry too much about it. I don't think you need to remove the old installation. Just try running the new one and see if it works. You may have to clean out some of your package. Like if you install packages using package.el or even straight.el, if you delete the folder where all those packages get installed and then let it re-download and rebuild all of those, then you'll probably be in good shape, I think. Mani says, I actually like the long form ones. Yeah, some people do, but I feel like a lot of people probably look at the length of the video in the thumbnail and they're like, yeah, I don't really want to sit for an hour and watch a video on Emacs Lisp or something like that. So I kind of feel like it would be better for everyone if all of videos were short enough that it isn't intimidating. All right, I think that's gonna be it for the day. So thank you all for being here. I really appreciate all the contributions from everyone in the chat today. There's a lot of really great ideas, a lot of really great feedback. Hopefully it was useful to you to see the challenges that other people had as well, especially if you've had challenges and you felt like, well, maybe it's just me. Well, no, there's a lot of challenges that a lot of people have, and they're probably similar to things you've seen as well. So hopefully this is encouraging to you to continue working towards learning Emacs deeply, because there's a lot you can get out of it. And, you know, sometimes there are roadblocks, but it's worth it, in my opinion. Yes, thank you all for being here for sure. Tyler says, you mentioned X widgets. What is X widgets and why is X widgets? I think it's basically being able to pull in X11 windows or controls into Emacs directly. So like a browser or some other program. People have used it for pulling in browsers into Emacs, but I haven't tried it myself. All right, so before I go, I just want to say thank you to my sponsors. These people have decided to sponsor the work that I'm doing, making videos about GNU Emacs and GNU Geeks, and I'm very thankful to them for their support. If you're interested in becoming a sponsor of the channel, check out the links below in the description. I'm on both GitHub sponsors and Patreon. I also have a link to PayPal for one-time tips. And if you're not interested in supporting in that way, you could definitely help out by liking the stream and any other video that we post. It helps out with the YouTube algorithm. It helps other people find the videos, so that'd be very helpful. And if you want to just share the videos, anything you find interesting with people you know who might be interested, it would be very helpful as well. So until next time, thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. Keep an eye out for that video on Orgrome next week. And until next time, thanks a lot. Happy hacking. We'll see you.